Welcome top news today.
Updated March 5, 2018. 185,421. Donald Trump emphatically promised to exempt Australian steel and aluminium from US tariffs during a meeting with Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull last year, it can be revealed. Key pointsMr. Trump and Mr Turnbull had a meeting last year in the so-called Steel CageThe US. Tariffs would impose a 25% tax on imported steel and 10% for aluminium. Mr Trump promised Australia would be exempt during a meeting last year. The ABC understands the promise was witnessed by high-ranking officials on both sides of the meeting, which was held on the sidelines of the G20 meeting in Hamburg, Germany, in July 2017. Among those in the U.S. delegation who saw the undertaking firsthand were U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin, Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross and White House Chief Economics Advisor Gary Cohn. On the Australian side were Finance Minister Matthias Cormann and the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet David Gruen. This revelation explains why the Australian government has been stunned by Mr Trump's declaration last week that the tariff regime will be enforced, and subsequent statements by Mr Ross that country-specific exemptions are unlikely. The conversation between the President and the Prime Minister was in the so-called Steel Cage, a secure communications pod that travels with the US President. Sources have told the ABC Mr Trump's promise was emphatic and that he instructed Mr Ross to work out the specifics to make it happen. The Prime Minister and the Australian delegation was absolutely certain that a deal had been struck during the Hamburg meeting. And having secured the assurance, the Turnbull government dispatched Ambassador Joe Hockey to follow it through with the Trump administration in Washington. The U.S. tariffs, which have alarmed major exporters such as BlueScope, would impose a 25% tax on imported steel and 10% for aluminium. Australia exports about $500 million in steel and aluminium to the U.S. a year. Federal government officials have been increasingly pessimistic about Australia's chances of dodging the U.S. steel and aluminium tariffs unveiled by Mr Trump. Mr Turnbull and Trade Minister Steve Chobot have been lobbying the Trump administration to spare Australia from the tariffs. Mr Chobot has been urgently trying to clarify whether Australian steel and aluminium will be hit. My concern remains that off the back of actions like this we could see retaliatory measures put in place by other major economies. That's in Noon's interests. Let's be clear, Mr Chobot said last week. Opposition leader Bill Shorten said he hoped Mr Turnbull would get on the phone and at least try to secure an exemption for Australia. Mr Shorten presented the issue as a litmus test for the US alliance. Australia and America have been allies in all sorts of adversity and conflict. I hope at times like this that all of our other friendship counts for something, he said. Topics: Australia, United States. First posted March 5, 2018. 182,257.